The night of April 7th, 2014, 32-year-old Robin Spielbauer tucked her 10-year-old daughter into bed in their house in Amarillo, Texas. Robin told her daughter that she loved her, said goodnight, and then walked out of the room. Robin could hear the TV on in the front room of the house, and she began heading that way, but before she got there, she stopped to look in on her younger daughter. Robin peeked into her bedroom and saw the little girl was already fast asleep. And as soon as she saw this, Robin just felt this complete sense of calm come over her. As a single mother with 2 young kids, Robin's days could get busy and chaotic. But she was finally able to relax each night when she knew her daughters were safe and sound in their beds like they were right now. Robin left the bedroom and walked down the hall into the front room of the house, where she found her mom and dad watching TV. Robin took a seat on the couch with her parents, grabbed her phone out of her jeans pocket, and quickly sent a text message. Robin's mom looked over and asked her daughter if everything was okay. She was fine, just making some plans. Robin knew her parents loved having her and the 2 girls in the house, and they played a huge part in helping her take care of the kids. But Robin thought in a perfect world, she would not be living with her parents in her early 30s. Because for many years before she wound up back at her parents' house, Robin had been living a life she loved on her own. When she was 22, she had fallen in love with a great guy named J.D. Spielbauer. J.D. was a former United States Marine and had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Robin's father had been in the military most of his life, and so her parents had been really happy when Robin started dating a military veteran. Robin got pregnant just 2 months after they started dating, and so she and JD had their first daughter, then got married, and then they had their second daughter a few years later. And for Robin, ever since she was young, all she had wanted was to be a mom. And so she didn't really care that she and JD struggled with money sometimes, or that raising kids really wasn't always easy. She and her husband loved each other, and they had these 2 beautiful girls. That was more than enough to be grateful for. But in 2012, after she and JD had been together for almost 10 years, everything began to change. JD became distant, and he started spending a lot of time away from home. And not long after that, Robin had discovered that JD was cheating on her with a woman named Katie Phipps, who just happened to be one of Robin's friends from church. After Robin had learned that her husband and friend were having this affair, she divorced JD, took the kids, and moved back in with her parents. And not long after that, JD had married Katie Phipps, which really only added to the tension. Back on the couch, Robin's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the text, smiled, and got up. She told her parents she would have to run out for a bit, and asked if they could watch the kids while she was gone. Her mom said of course, and then asked if Robin was going out to meet her new boyfriend. Robin blushed a little, but didn't respond. Then she just grabbed her purse, told her parents she wouldn't be gone too long, and walked out the front door. A few minutes later, at about 9:30 p.m., Robin drove her black Chevy Tahoe out of town and turned onto Helium Road, which was a long, winding dirt road surrounded by farmland on both sides. As she drove, Robin cranked up the country music on the radio and looked out at the huge Texas night sky. The only light on the road came from her headlights and the moon, and this made Robin feel like she was out in the middle of nowhere. But that was perfect as far as she was concerned. In fact, that's why she'd chosen Helium Road for this meeting in the first place. She didn't want anyone to see what she was about to do. Eventually, Robin pulled her SUV over to the side of the road, put it in park, and began to wait. And as she did, she listened to the radio and looked out the window. And then eventually, she saw headlights coming down the road behind her. The following day, at noon, almost 15 hours after Robin had left her house, a middle-aged man drove his truck down Helium Road. The sun was bright, and it was about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It looked and felt like a perfect spring day. As the man was driving, he spotted something in the distance, so he slowed down and squinted. And he was surprised by what he saw. 3 young girls were running down the road right towards him, and they were screaming. This part of Helium Road was usually pretty deserted, and it wasn't really a place where kids played. So the man immediately hit his brakes, put his truck in park, and stepped outside to see what was going on. He walked over to the girls and asked if they were okay. and without breaking their stride, all three girls pointed behind them and started yelling, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man looked where the girls were pointing, and he saw there was a black SUV parked on the side of the road. He told the girls to stay where they were, and then he ran over to the SUV. And when he got there, at first glance, it just looked like somebody had abandoned the vehicle. However, when he walked to the passenger side of the SUV and looked at the ground, he just froze. The man was in total shock at what he saw, and it horrified him that three young kids were clearly the first ones to have stumbled onto this scene. The man took a breath and steadied himself, then he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. A little later that afternoon, Sergeant Alan Mongold of the Randall County Sheriff's Department sped down Helium Road. Up ahead, he saw there was an ambulance, cop cars, and a fire truck, and then behind him, driving as well, were more police cars. Sergeant Mongold could not think of a time ever when this spot on Helium Road, basically in the middle of all this farmland, had been so crowded. He eventually pulled over and parked his car not far from a black SUV and got out. And immediately, an officer ran over to meet him and said he'd taken statements from the three young girls and the man who had been there when he arrived, but he'd arranged for the girls to be taken home, and he'd sent that man on his way. Mongold said that was fine. He would follow up with them if he needed to. And then he and the other officer walked around to the passenger side of this black SUV, and they joined a group of paramedics who were already standing there. But as soon as Mongold looked at the ground just outside the car, it was clear the paramedics could not do anything. Because lying there on the ground was a woman's body. And based on all the bugs crawling on her, Mongold knew she must have been dead for at least several hours. Mongold put on his gloves and crouched down next to the body. The woman was on her back, and immediately Mongold saw a deep dark bruise on the left side of her head. And at first glance, this bruise did not appear to be something she got just from falling down or something. It looked like something had been smashed into the side of her head, like a heavy object. And so at this point, Mongold felt confident he was very likely dealing with a murder. He reached into the woman's pockets, but found they were empty. So he told one of the officers on hand to run the plates of the SUV. And then he and the others started to do a sweep of the area. Within minutes, Mongold saw the officer who had just run the plates waving him over. Mongold joined him, and the officer said that the SUV was registered to a woman whose name was Robin Spielbauer, and the image of Robin Spielbauer that popped up matched the victim. Pretty soon, members of the county's forensics team arrived, and Sergeant Mongold searched the area around Robin's body and her SUV again. And this time, a forensic tech saw something that seemed really strange. The back windshield of Robin's SUV had a small crack in it, and embedded in the crack were tiny pieces of hot pink plastic. Now, neither the forensics tech nor Sergeant Mongold had any idea what this pink plastic was from. But the tech said hopefully that would become clear after they ran some tests. The investigative team spent hours searching up and down Helium Road, hoping to find a potential murder weapon or maybe Robin's cell phone. But other than those pink plastic flecks on the SUV windshield, there really wasn't much to go on. Mongold considered the possibility that this could have been a robbery gone wrong, that someone had gotten Robin to stop her car, attacked her, and had stolen her purse and her phone. But the idea that a carjacker would choose this road to try to rob someone where there wasn't a whole lot of traffic just didn't make a lot of sense to him. And so Mongold couldn't help but think that maybe Robin's killer was someone she knew. The following morning, April 9th, Sergeant Mongold sat at his desk reviewing the autopsy report. The report stated that Robin had most likely died the night before her body was found, and that her body had just laid outdoors on the side of the road overnight. And even more importantly, the autopsy report confirmed that Robin had been murdered. Because in addition to the blunt force trauma wound that Mongold had found on the side of her head, the medical examiner had also discovered a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber pistol in the back of Robin's head. So, that morning, Sergeant Mongold went to meet with Robin's friends and family to learn as much as he could about her. and also to see if anyone close to Robin owned a .22. Mangold had informed Robin's parents about the death of their daughter the previous night, and even without the results of the autopsy report, he had told them he believed there had been foul play. And so through their complete shock and grief, Robin's parents had given Mangold a list of the few people who had been closest to Robin. And now, Mangold decided to start with her new boyfriend, a bartender named Jared. But the conversation with Jared proved to be pretty uneventful. Jared said he'd been working at the bar the night that Robin had died. He said she hadn't called him or texted him or anything. And Mangold was able to quickly track down multiple people at the bar who corroborated Jared's alibi. Now, the detective had no intention of crossing Jared off his list this early on, but Jared did not jump out as an obvious suspect. And so Mangold figured if Robin's current boyfriend didn't look like a major suspect, well, the next logical step was to talk to her ex-husband, J.D. Spielbauer. Later that day, now over 24 hours after Robin's body had been found, Sergeant Mangold knocked on the front door of J.D.'s house. And as he knocked, Mangold felt a bit surprised by where he was standing, because J.D. lived only a few houses away from Robin's parents' house. The door opened, and a woman who looked like she was in her late 20s with long brown hair and bright blue eyes was standing there. Mangold introduced himself, and the woman said her name was Katie, and that she was J.D.'s wife. She said news had traveled fast, so she already knew about the murder, and she assumed that's why Mangold was here, to talk about it. Mangold nodded, but before he could say much more, a tall, thin man with a cropped military-style haircut stepped outside. He introduced himself as J.D. Spielbauer. But immediately, his wife, Katie, snapped at him and told him to shut up, because she was talking to the police. J.D. immediately hung his head and fell silent. Sergeant Mangold acted like he didn't notice any of that, but in reality, he was taken aback. Married couples, even ones that didn't necessarily get along, rarely lashed out at each other in front of him, especially when they knew they could be potential suspects in a murder case. But Mangold remained calm and polite and asked them where they'd been the night that Robin died. Katie said that she and her son had been at a friend's house, and they had come home around 10 p.m. J.D. said he'd been home all night with his uncle, who also lived in the house. They'd just been drinking beer and playing some pool. Other than Katie's quick outburst at J.D., nothing the couple did after that seemed particularly strange. However, for some reason, Mangold just felt like there was a good chance both of these people were lying to his face. He talked to them for a bit longer, and then as they wrapped up, he told them he would be in touch if he needed any more information. But as he walked back to his car, Mangold already knew he'd be calling J.D. and Katie down to the station soon. He just needed to be better prepared if he was really going to interview them. After leaving J.D. and Katie's house, Mangold drove a few minutes across town to Robin's best friend Aaron's house. Robin's parents had told Mangold that Robin and Aaron were extremely close and shared basically everything with each other. So Mangold thought she'd be a great person to talk to learn more about Robin, but also he figured if anybody had inside information on Robin's ex-husband and his new wife, it might be Aaron. And as it would turn out, Aaron knew a whole lot about Robin's ex and his new wife. She told him that at one point, she, Robin, J.D., and Katie had all been friends. But then J.D. and Katie had an affair, and things got ugly. She said Robin constantly worried about the kids and wondered if she and J.D. should really be trying to co-parent them. Aaron also said that J.D. talked a lot about suffering from PTSD because of his time in combat as a Marine. Mangold took notes on everything Aaron was telling him. An affair, a divorce, and a potential custody battle could all be motives for murder. And while Mangold did not believe that all military vets suffering from PTSD were inherently violent, J.D.'s condition was still something he had to consider. But Aaron would tell Mangold something else that would instantly make him rethink his entire approach to J.D. and Katie. Aaron said late last year, Robin had gone over to J.D. and Katie's house to drop off the kids. However, when Katie had come in and seen her husband and Robin talking, she screamed, grabbed Robin, slammed her into the fireplace, and threatened to ruin her life. That evening, Sergeant Mongold led JD into an interview room at the sheriff's station, and then he sat down next to him at a small round table that was pushed up against the wall. JD was wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap that he kept messing with like he was nervous. Mongold had spent most of the previous night trying to learn as much as possible about Robin, JD, and Katie's relationship, and he had worked with the phone company to secure a copy of text messages sent to and from Robin's cell phone. Mongold started the interview by asking JD to give him an overview of what he'd been doing on the night Robin died. JD spoke in a slow Texas drawl. He was polite and addressed Mongold as Sir, and he said basically the same thing he'd told Mongold when they met at the house. He'd been hanging out with his uncle at home, drinking and shooting pool. Mongold nodded and asked if he'd seen Robin at all on that day, but JD shook his head and said he had not seen or talked to her. Sergeant Mongold reached down and grabbed a file folder out of a briefcase. He opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. Then he turned to JD and said he wanted to help him because clearly JD was having trouble remembering things clearly. Mongold told JD that this piece of paper was a record of all the text messages Robin had sent and received on the night she died, and her final text exchange was with JD just before 9:30 p.m. And it was clear from this text that the two of them had been planning to meet up that night. JD immediately took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair. He apologized for lying, and then as he tried to explain himself, he started to stammer. Finally, he got out that Robin was supposed to meet him that night at his house to talk about a standardized test their older daughter was supposed to take. However, JD said Robin never showed up. At this point, Mongold really began to press JD. He asked him if Robin had never showed up, why hadn't he reached out to her? And JD really struggled to come up with an answer. He remained polite and kept calling Mongold Sir, but as he was doing that, Mongold got the impression that this was not a man who planned things out, or who could easily organize his thoughts. And so eventually, Mongold told JD that he could assume only one of two things. JD had lied because he was the one who murdered Robin, or he had lied to cover for someone else. JD just shook his head and said he would never hurt Robin. But Mongold snapped back and said, well, if you didn't kill her, who did? JD went quiet for a second, and then he looked up at Mongold and just said, I have suspicions. Now, during this interview, JD did not come out and actually say who he suspected, but Mongold thought it was pretty clear. In fact, Mongold had the same suspicion since he talked to Robin's friend Aaron. So Mongold didn't waste any time. He let JD go, and then had JD's wife, Katie, brought to the station and into the same small interview room. Katie was wearing a sweatshirt with a pink camouflage pattern on it, and while her husband, JD, had looked very nervous when he came in, Katie, on the other hand, just looked mad. But before Sergeant Mongold could even ask her a question, she said she needed him, Mongold, to tell her something. She said she needed to know if JD was having an affair with his ex-wife, Robin. Mongold said he didn't know if that was the case, but he did know that JD and Robin had planned to see each other on the night that Robin died. After hearing this, Katie broke down sobbing and put her face in her hands. She said she knew it. She knew Robin had been trying to tear her marriage apart because Robin had never gotten over JD after the divorce. But despite all the obvious anger Katie felt towards Robin, she insisted that she had nothing to do with Robin's murder. However, despite what Katie and JD said during their interviews, Sergeant Mongold still decided to secure search warrants for their house and their cell phones, and he felt sure he would soon be able to arrest one or both of them. On April 10th, so just 3 days after Robin's murder, Sergeant Mongold and the investigative team searched JD and Katie's house, and they quickly found a room filled with guns. Mongold didn't think that was strange, though. Amarillo, Texas was home to a lot of avid hunters, and most of the weapons in this room were hunting rifles. But one gun immediately caught the detective's eye. Sitting in an open case was a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol. Now, Robin had been shot with a .22. But that was not actually the only thing that made this gun stand out. This gun had hot pink plastic accents on part of the grip and the barrel. And when Mongold leaned down to get a better look, he noticed that part of the pink plastic on the grip was cracked, and that small pieces of the plastic appeared to be missing. And so right away, Mongold assumed that those small pieces of pink plastic that were missing must have wound up embedded in the back windshield of Robin's SUV. Investigators quickly found out that the gun was registered to Katie, and they even found photos she had posted on social media of her holding that gun. And later that day, when police searched Katie's text messages, they found something just as damning. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie had sent 336 text messages to JD, threatening to ruin him and Robin. And the final text message, number 336, which Katie had sent to JD about an hour before Robin had left her parents' house and driven out to Helium Road, said, "You started this whether you want to believe it or not. I will finish it." The Randall County Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office moved fast. On April 11th, 4 days after Robin's murder, they arrested Katie. However, before the case could go to trial, the DA wanted either a confession or clear evidence that demonstrated Katie had been driving on Helium Road on the night of the murder. Katie refused to confess. She just repeated her story that she had been with her son at a friend's house and then gone home at around 10 p.m. that night. Now, Katie's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the murder site at the time Robin was most likely killed, but that tower also would have pinged if she was driving from her friend's house to her house, so it was not the definitive evidence the DA was looking for. The search for some elusive piece of evidence that would ensure a guilty verdict began to frustrate the police. After all, Sergeant Mongold and his team had Katie's gun and her threatening text messages to JD, and they knew Katie had once slammed Robin into a fireplace. But Mongold and his team's hands were tied, because the DA's office had taken over the investigation. The DA's office wound up re-interviewing people connected to the case and also scouring surveillance footage from locations just outside of town to see if they could spot Katie's car pulling onto Helium Road. But none of this led to anything new, and the investigation dragged on for months. And so the DA began to worry that he would never find this piece of evidence that would definitively win over a jury. But on a day in July of 2015, over 15 months after Robin's murder, a woman who worked for the DA rushed into his office, and she had a very excited look on her face. She told the DA that she'd seen a story on the news about how certain cell phones left a clear digital footprint when they were connected to Wi-Fi. Essentially, police could use this Wi-Fi data to track exactly where a phone had been, which was far more information than a cell phone tower could provide. When the DA heard this, his face lit up. He'd never heard about this type of search. So he gathered his team, and they immediately got in contact with the phone and internet companies, and soon they were able to trace Katie's exact path on the night of the murder. This was exactly the kind of evidence the DA had been looking for. And not long after that, the DA got another big break when he was contacted by Robin Spielbauer's mom. She told him that she had just gotten this very bizarre phone call that she knew would help his investigation. And the information Robin's mom provided, along with the newly collected Wi-Fi data, finally solidified the case. Based on the information from Robin's mom, cell phone and Wi-Fi data, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what authorities believed happened to Robin Spielbauer on April 7, 2014. That night, the killer drove their truck through town, trailing just far enough behind Robin so as not to be spotted. The city lights slowly disappeared behind them as the killer followed Robin out onto a dark dirt road. And after a few more minutes of driving, the killer saw Robin pull over and park. And so the killer slowed down as well and parked right behind her. Once they were stopped, the killer put on a pair of gloves, grabbed a gun from the passenger seat, and then stepped outside, leaving their headlights on. The killer calmly walked towards the SUV, raised their gun, and slammed it against Robin's back windshield. The windshield cracked, and the killer heard Robin begin to scream from inside the vehicle. The driver's side door of the SUV suddenly flew open, and Robin lunged out of the car and started screaming at the killer. But the killer just raised their gun. Robin saw the gun in the headlights from the truck, and she ran towards the farmland that surrounded the road, trying to get away, but the killer followed, and they aimed at Robin in the low light, and they fired. The bullet struck Robin in the back of the head. She stumbled, her body twisted, and she fell to the ground on her back. The killer approached and saw Robin was still breathing, so they aimed the gun at her forehead and pulled the trigger again. But the gun jammed. The killer panicked. They rushed back to their truck, glancing over their shoulder to make sure Robin was not getting up and running off. The killer found a tire iron from the truck bed, took it, and ran back to the side of the road where Robin was still laying on the ground. The killer held up the tire iron and swung it hard into the side of Robin's head. Blood spilled from Robin's temple out onto the ground. Now she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the side of the road. The killer leaned down and took Robin's cell phone out of her pocket. They searched her other pocket for personal items, but she didn't have anything else on her. So the killer walked over to her SUV, leaned inside through the open driver's side door, and grabbed Robin's purse. And then with that in hand, they shut the door behind them. The killer ran back to their truck, hopped in the driver's seat, and sped off down the dirt road back towards their house in town. Once back inside the safety of their home, the killer walked right into their gun room, and they would put the gun they had just used to shoot Robin, a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol with a pink plastic grip, into an open gun case. At this point, the killer took a deep breath and began to calm down. They were convinced the police would eventually find this pink gun. And when they did, they would believe Katie had murdered Robin. Katie Phipps would stay in prison for over a year awaiting trial, while the DA's office tried to find evidence that would ensure her conviction in court. But Katie didn't murder Robin. Her husband, JD, did. It would turn out that Katie's suspicions about JD and Robin had been correct. JD, who had cheated on Robin with Katie, had now begun cheating on Katie with Robin. But JD knew Katie had caught on, and the whole thing had now turned into a total mess. He wanted both women out of his life, so he murdered his ex-wife and framed his current wife for the crime. On the night of the murder, the way JD had lured Robin to Helium Road was he had been texting back and forth with her to set up a meeting on that secluded road. That way they could carry on their affair without being seen. Police had considered JD a suspect, but the bulk of the evidence they found seemed to point to his wife Katie. She had sent hundreds of threatening text messages, had physically assaulted Robin, and had claimed she was going to, quote, finish what JD had inadvertently started. And when tests were run on Katie's gun, the pink plastic from the weapon matched the pink plastic police had found embedded in Robin's back windshield. And so, after only a 4-day investigation, police had arrested and jailed Katie. But over a year later, as investigators and the DA tried to shore up their case before going to court, new evidence came to light. Katie's phone had not been connected to Wi-Fi on the night of her murder. However, her son's phone had. And so using the Wi-Fi data from her son's phone, in connection with cell phone tower from Katie's phone, police were able to see that on the night of the murder, Katie's route was directly from her friend's house back to her own house. At that point, they realized Katie had been telling the truth. She did not kill Robin. Also, investigators came to believe that many of Katie's threatening text messages to JD might have been about divorcing him and exposing his affair, not about harming Robin. So with this new evidence, police released Katie from jail, and the DA admitted he had rushed to judgment about her guilt. Once Katie was out, investigators quickly turned their attention to JD. And one of the first things they discovered was that JD's stories about suffering from PTSD were a complete lie. Because JD had never served in the military. It was just something he lied about to impress women. And so the fact he had successfully carried out this lie for years and had even convinced police it was true, helped lead the investigators to believe that JD was much craftier than they had given him credit for. They came to assume that everything he'd told them during the investigation was potentially a lie, and that he had the personality and the mental capacity to frame someone else for murder. And then finally, when investigators really began to move in on JD, Robin's mom contacted the DA about this bizarre phone call she got. She said that JD had called her and asked her to lend him a significant amount of money so that he could take his daughters on a trip to New York ASAP. With everything else investigators had learned, they saw this as a huge red flag. They believed the reason JD was trying to go to New York was actually just to make a run for the Canadian border. So they arrested JD before he could leave town, and they charged him with the murder of his ex-wife Robin. JD was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He'll have a chance for parole in 2046. Despite the conviction, some members of the sheriff's department continued to believe that Katie had played a role in this crime. But once she was released from jail, Katie was never arrested or charged again in connection with Robin's murder. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In the early 1990s, a woman in her early 20s, named Krista Frater, was working as a manager inside of a retail store called the Boston Store in Madison, Wisconsin. Not long after she was hired there, the Boston Store would hire another employee to work at their Madison location. His name was Bart Halderson, and like Krista, he was in his early 20s, although he was 3 years younger than Krista, and he was hired to be a clerk. Bart and Krista didn't know each other before working at the same location, but their shifts often overlapped, and so in time they got to know each other, and they found they had a lot in common. They both had grown up roughly outside of Madison, Wisconsin. They both had graduated from the same college, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they both shared a love of home design. Krista, who had majored in art history in college, was very passionate about interior home design. As for Bart, he was just one of those people who naturally could fix just about anything with his bare hands, and growing up, his favorite projects were anything to do with home repairs. Whether it was something super simple or super complex, he didn't care. He just found it incredibly satisfying to keep a home in immaculate condition. And so Bart and Krista bonded over their commonalities, and in time, their working friendship evolved into a full-fledged romance. And by 1994, they had left the Boston Store, they had gotten married, and they had moved in together to their own apartment in DeForest, Wisconsin, which is not far from Madison. 2 years after that, in 1996, Bart and Krista welcomed their first child into the world. It was a little boy who they named Mitchell. And as soon as Mitchell was born, Krista decided she wanted to stay home with the baby, and Bart was in full support, and so he went out and he got a great job as an accountant, which paid enough money to pay for the whole family. And 18 months after Mitchell was born, Bart and Krista welcomed their second and final child, another boy who they named Chandler. A few years after Chandler was born, Bart and Krista had saved up just enough money that they could finally afford to buy a house of their own. And the house they finally settled on was just this very modest, small 2-story home in this very quiet little town in Wisconsin called Windsor. Windsor is not far from DeForest, where they had been renting an apartment. But this little house in Windsor was perfect for Bart, Krista, and their boys. Not only did it have enough space for the family, but because it was their own house, as soon as they moved in, Krista got to really lean in to her passion for interior design, and she got to design the entire layout of the house. And then she continued to take pride in keeping the house perfectly tidy and beautiful at all times. As for Bart, he immediately began doing home repair project after home repair project. This house became his trophy, and he wanted to make sure his trophy was polished at all times. And it wasn't just the physical house that made this feel like their forever home.
It was also their neighbors. As soon as they moved in, Bart and Krista made friends with all of the people that lived on their street, and they were all so friendly and welcoming. And then before long, the Haldersons were deeply invested in community activities like the Boy Scouts and the Kiwanis Club, and they were donating their time and money to other charities. I mean, so quickly, the Halderson family just found where they belonged. And over the next 2+ decades, life for the Haldersons in this little home in Windsor remained perfect. Bart continued to move up the ladder at his accounting firm, and Krista continued to be a devoted mother and housekeeper. As for the kids, Mitchell and Chandler, they were given every opportunity their parents could possibly give them. And in that loving and supportive environment, they both thrived. By 2021, the older brother, Mitchell, who was 25 at the time, he had moved out and was living alone in an apartment, and he had graduated from college. He had landed an incredible IT job with a local, very successful company. He was engaged to be married, and he was about to buy his own house. As for the younger brother, Chandler, who was 23 at the time, he was still living at home with Bart and Krista, but he was doing just as well as his older brother. He was in his final year of college, but he had already accepted a full-time job with SpaceX that was set to start in Florida as soon as he graduated. And while he was in his final year of college, in between his studies, he worked part-time at a local insurance company to help pay rent to his parents, and he also volunteered the rest of his spare time with the Madison Police Department on their rescue scuba diving team. Chandler was also in a committed relationship with his girlfriend. But despite how well everything was going for Bart, for Krista, for Mitchell, for Chandler, their lives were about to take a serious turn for the worst. It all started in June of 2021. That month, Chandler, who was only weeks away from flying out to Titusville, Florida to start his job with SpaceX, fell down an entire flight of stairs, smashing his head in the process. Now, he immediately picked himself up and tried to tell himself that he was okay, but over the course of that day, he started to feel woozy and disoriented, and his legs started to feel numb. And so in a panic, he rushed himself to the hospital, and unfortunately, when they scanned his brain and they checked him out, the doctors discovered he had a severe concussion from this fall, and he had a brain bleed that almost certainly would require surgery at some point down the road. Also, the numbness in his legs appeared to be the result of permanent nerve damage. And so suddenly, Chandler, who was so excited about this opportunity in Florida, is now back home in a neck brace with a cane to get around. And even with the cane, he can barely walk. And then adding insult to injury, he almost immediately lost the job at SpaceX because he couldn't travel to Florida to start the job. And so they filled it with someone else. Chandler did his best to stay positive and optimistic, but I mean, this was a crushing blow. Everything he had worked for had just been taken away. And it was crushing for his family too. I mean, seeing their beloved Chaz, as they called him, laying on the couch looking totally miserable and depressed all day was awful. But despite how bad Chandler's accident was, the trauma it inflicted on Chandler and his family was nothing compared to what happened next. The Haldersons owned a small cabin that was located in a part of Wisconsin called White Lake. It was located about 3 hours drive to the north of their home in Windsor, and the cabin was situated inside of this rural forested area right near a big lake called White Lake, hence the name of the area. This cabin had been in the Halderson family since the 1940s, and when Mitchell and Chandler were little kids, Bart and Krista would take them up there all the time to go fishing, to go swimming, or just to relax. It was like their vacation home. But at some point, Chandler and Mitchell reached a certain age where they weren't that interested in going to the cabin anymore, and so as a result, Bart and Krista basically stopped going. However, just 2 weeks after Chandler's horrific injury, there was this huge storm that rolled through the White Lake area, and after the storm had passed, some people who lived permanently in White Lake called Bart and Krista and told them, hey, I was driving past your cabin and I saw there was some broken windows. It looks like your cabin might have been damaged from this storm. And so Bart and Krista, they're thinking, oh my goodness, we got to get up there as soon as we can and patch up that window and fix the rest of the cabin before another storm rolls through and totally ruins the cabin. And so Bart and Krista pull out their calendar and they see the next weekend coming up is the 4th of July weekend. The 4th of July is a very big holiday in America. It's when we celebrate our independence. And the way White Lake celebrates the 4th of July is with a big parade down Main Street and these amazing fireworks out over White Lake. And so Bart and Krista, they figure, you know what, let's just hold off and head up to our cabin in a couple of days to time it with the 4th of July weekend, and we can make the necessary repairs, and we can enjoy the festivities of the holiday and kind of have a mini vacation up there. And so that was all fine and good, but right before they left for this trip up to White Lake, Bart and Krista started acting a little weird. On the evening of Thursday, July 1st, the day before Bart and Krista are supposed to leave for this trip, they begin packing up their things. And since Chandler lives with them, he's at home, he sees them doing this, and at some point he kind of got up and hobbled over and tried to help them pack, but that was short-lived because his legs were so weak. And so he sat down and just kind of watched them pack. And what he saw is they were packing lots and lots of cash and silver bars into their luggage. Although this was kind of odd to Chandler, he decided not to say anything because he figured, you know what, maybe they want to stash their cash and silver in the cabin like a keepsake, I don't know, but it's their business, it's not mine. And so Bart and Krista, they continue to pack up their things, and Chandler, because he can't go anywhere, just continues to kind of watch them pack. And at some point, Chandler asks his parents, so how are you getting up to White Lake? And his parents would say, oh, we're just getting a ride from our friends, another couple, they're driving us up. But they didn't tell him who the couple was. They basically just said, it's our friends. And so again, Chandler's sitting there thinking, okay, this whole thing is a little bit weird, but you know what? It's their business. I'm not going to ask about it. They obviously don't want to tell me. And so he just kind of let it go. And so at some point, Bart and Krista, they finish packing and they move all their luggage to the front of the house right near the front door. And then a little while later, they and Chandler would retreat to their rooms and they would go to sleep. The next morning, July 2nd, Friday, Chandler got up early, about 6 a.m. And when he got up, he began slowly hobbling his way down the stairs, expecting to see his mom and dad having breakfast and, getting ready to leave because they certainly wouldn't have left without telling him. But he gets downstairs and the house is dark and totally empty, and all of the bags that his parents had packed the night before and put near the front door, they were all gone. And so Chandler's thinking, did my parents get up at like 5 a.m. and leave without telling me? And so he goes to the door and he looks out the window thinking, maybe they're out there waiting outside. But when he looked outside, his parents weren't out there. And sure enough, their cars were still in the driveway. And so Chandler was left to believe that, well, I guess my parents did get picked up by whoever these friends were, and they did not feel the need to come tell me they were leaving. Now, this did leave Chandler a little bit shaken up. He just kept thinking about the strangeness of what they were packing and the fact that he didn't know who they were going with, and now this sudden departure. But again, Chandler just told himself that his parents would be just fine. These are just kind of random anomalies, but they're not indicative of there being any issue here. And so Chandler found a way to just kind of push these concerns out of his mind, and he just went about his day. And so because his parents were now going to be gone for the weekend, he promptly called his girlfriend, Catherine, and asked her to come over and stay at his house with him for a couple of days. And so she comes over, and because Chandler can't really do anything because of his injury, they basically spent the weekend just kind of lounging around and eating nice food and watching Netflix. But by the end of the weekend, on Sunday morning, there was an undertone that both of them noticed that something was wrong. Chandler had told his girlfriend about the strangeness of his parents' quick departure to White Lake, but he had said to her, I'm sure it's fine, and she basically said the same thing, that of course your parents are fine. But by Sunday, Bart and Krista had still not called or texted or checked in with Chandler or Mitchell or anybody. They were just totally gone and silent. And whenever Chandler or Catherine tried calling Bart or Krista's cell phone, it didn't even ring. It just went straight to voicemail. But by late that day, Sunday, July 4th, when really concerns were starting to mount about what happened to Bart and Krista, Krista would text her son, Chandler. And what she basically said was, hey, we arrived in White Lake, it's packed here, the service is terrible, but we're going to stick around for the parade, and we'll be back either Monday night or Tuesday early. And so as soon as Chandler and Catherine saw this text message, it was like all their worries were completely gone, and they were just excited to see Bart and Krista when they came back the next day or the day after. But the next day, Monday, Bart and Krista did not come home. They didn't call anyone. They didn't text anyone. And again, whenever anybody tried calling their cell phones, which now was Chandler, Catherine, and also Mitchell, who had been looped in on what's going on with his parents, whenever they tried calling them, Bart and Krista's phone didn't ring. It just went straight to voicemail. And then the day after that, on Tuesday, July 6th, so this was the day that Krista said they would be home by, they didn't come home. And again, no one could get in touch with them. And again, they did not contact anyone. Additionally, on Tuesday, Krista's office began calling Chandler and Mitchell, asking if they knew where Krista was. Krista had recently taken up a customer service job at an auto body shop, and apparently she was scheduled to work on that day, Tuesday the 6th, and she was scheduled to work on that previous Friday, which was the day Bart and Krista left for the lake, meaning she had left on this trip without telling anybody at work. And according to her boss, Krista was the type of person who, even if she was running a couple of minutes late, she would call ahead or text ahead and let people know. So for her to just completely not show up and tell no one was totally out of character. But before Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine could process this information, Bart's employer began calling them, asking the same things. Hey, do you know where Bart is? He's supposed to be working right now, and we can't get in touch with him, and he didn't put in for time off. And so all afternoon on Tuesday the 6th, Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine and other family members are trying to call Bart and Krista. They're calling other people in White Lake to see if anybody knows where they are, but nobody does. And so finally, the next morning on Wednesday, July 7th, when still there was no word from Bart and Krista, Chandler goes to the police and he files a missing person report. And pretty much right away, the police in Windsor contacted the police up north in White Lake and asked them to do a check on this cabin to see if maybe Bart and Krista were there. And maybe they just had terrible service, or, maybe there was some sort of accident or something that happened. But when the White Lake police arrived at the Halderson cabin, Bart and Krista were not there. No one was there. In fact, the cabin looked like it had not been used in months. The outside was totally overgrown, and inside there was no food in the fridge. And interestingly, the police would also tell Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine that there was no damage done to this cabin. There were no broken windows or any sign, at least no obvious sign, of storm damage to this cabin. And so after this revelation, of course, Bart and Krista's family is like, wait a minute, who called them and told them to head up there to fix these obvious broken windows? Are those the same mystery friends that drove them up in the first place? I mean, what's going on here? Was this some sort of trap? Have they been set up? Are they okay? And so by the following day, Thursday, July 8th, when still there was no sign of Bart or Krista, and the police really didn't have any new leads to speak of, Chandler was desperate, and so he went to local media and he said, please run a story about my parents and get the word out there that they're missing and maybe someone knows something and they'll come forward. And so local media, they would do that. They would run this piece. And so while this media coverage is going on the 8th, Chandler would go back to his home and he would hobble door to door, asking each of his neighbors if they had a security camera on the front of their house that might have picked up an angle of the street and so may have seen his parents on the morning of July 2nd when they climbed into that mystery couple's car that took them up to White Lake. Chandler was hoping that if he got this footage, somebody would be able to identify who these mystery friends were. But unfortunately, none of his neighbors had that footage. But as it would turn out, it didn't matter, because on that day, the 8th, the police made a discovery that at first seemed relatively minor, relatively small, but when they examined it more closely, they realized it was a huge discovery and it completely broke the case wide open. To understand this breakthrough, we have to go back to June 29th, 2021. So 3 days before Bart and Krista hopped into that mystery person's car and headed up to White Lake. On that day, June 29th, Bart had finally just had it. There had been something bothering him for a really long time, and he had just finally decided, you know what? today I'm going to get to the bottom of it. And so Bart pulled out his phone, he punched in a number, he put it to his ear, and after a few rings, a young man named Omar Job answered his call. In total, Bart and Omar would talk on the phone for a total of 17 minutes. And for the first half of the call, it was basically just Bart being really angry and aggressive towards Omar. But then during the second half of the call, when Omar really had a chance to speak for the first time, Bart's tone completely changed. He was no longer angry. He actually sounded totally defeated. And so after this 17-minute phone call finally comes to an end, Bart is left kind of in shock, but he knows he now needs to set up an even more intense meeting with a group of people, and he needs to tell them what he just learned from Omar. And within 24 hours, Bart had set this additional high-stakes meeting with this other group. It was set for 3 p.m. on July 1st. July 1st was the day before Bart and Krista would leave for White Lake. And so on July 1st, the day of this new pivotal meeting, Bart was working from home, and at some point he looked at his watch and he saw it was just after 2 p.m. And even though this meeting he was going to have was still an hour away, the location of the meeting was a bit of a drive away, and so he knew he needed to leave soon. And so Bart stopped working and he texted Chandler, who was in the house with him. He just said, "Ready to leave when you are." Chandler was aware of how important this meeting was for his dad. He also understood the terrible position his dad was in. And so he had agreed to go with his dad to this meeting. And so after a couple of minutes, both Chandler and Bart have gotten dressed and ready for this meeting, and they met downstairs on the first floor, and after kind of a nod to each other, they begin walking towards the front door. But then something happens. Chandler was standing behind Bart, and so as they're moving towards the door, Chandler reaches out and grabs a rifle he was hiding on the first floor. He raises it and he fires at least 2 shots into his father's back. And then once his father fell to the ground and was either dead or dying, Chandler, calm as can be, pulled out his phone and he texted his mother and told her, "Hey, Dad's phone is dead, so just text me." And then Chandler also sent his mother a text saying, "Get soda on your way home." To which his mother just wrote, "'Kay, I can," smiley face. All Chandler was trying to do was buy as much time as possible to prep the house for his mother's return. And so over the next couple of hours, we don't know exactly what Chandler did, but it's assumed he moved his father's body into some hiding place, and then after maybe trying to clean up a little bit, Chandler laid in wait for his mother. And at 4:58 p.m., Krista would clock out of her job at the automotive shop. She would make a pit stop at a store to buy Chandler some soda, and then between 5:15 and 5:30, security cameras on neighbors' houses would pick her up pulling into her driveway. And then just a couple of minutes later, she walked inside of her beautiful little dream home where she had raised her family over the past couple of decades, only to be immediately gunned down by her son the second she walked inside. It would turn out Chandler was living a double life. He had never graduated from college. He had gone to college, but for like a semester and flunked out. But he just kept telling his friends and family that he was progressing through college and then he graduated from college, all made up. He also did not have a job at the insurance company. He just told his family that he worked from home, which really meant he sat in his room and played video games all day. He was not a rescue scuba diver for the Madison Police Department because 1, he was not a scuba diver, and 2, because the Madison Police Department did not have a rescue scuba diving team. And needless to say, he did not have a job with SpaceX. He had never even applied. As for his head injury, he may have bumped his head at some point, and he did go to the doctors by himself sometime in mid-June, but that doctor just told him he might have a mild concussion and then offered him a neck brace and told him, "You don't need to wear it. That's only if you want to wear it." But then very quickly, Chandler turned this non-injury into a debilitating, crippling, life-altering injury and literally hobbled all around with a neck brace and cane. And the reason he did that is he needed an excuse for why he wasn't starting his job at SpaceX. In short, Chandler lied about virtually every aspect of his life to virtually everyone in his life. And for the most part, people did believe him. However, his parents were becoming more and more suspicious. Specifically, in 2021, he was telling them, oh yeah, I'm working at the insurance company, but he never had any money. He could barely pay rent to his family, if at all. And so his dad would say to him, how is it you are employed but have no money? And the way Chandler would handle this is he would create fake email accounts pretending to be people in HR at this insurance company, and then acting as them, he would write these convoluted emails that had these ridiculous excuses for why Chandler had not been paid yet. And so he would have that fake email account email his real account, and then Chandler, in his actual email, would write back really angrily and sternly saying, you gotta fix this, my family's not happy. And then he would once again pretend to be the HR person who would say, I'm sorry, it's some issue that you can't affect. We're gonna fix it, but you gotta wait. And Chandler would take these exchanges and he would forward them to his father. And while Bart didn't necessarily totally believe what he was being shown, it was enough to get him to stop asking questions. But Bart and Krista were also suspicious of other aspects of Chandler's life, like, for example, his school records. At some point, he needed to show them his transcripts, and he would tell them, oh, I can't access my transcripts. And so Bart and Krista are like, why? Can't you just log in and pull up your unofficial transcripts at least? And the way Chandler would handle this was the same way he handled the insurance company. He would create fictitious email accounts of people that were college advisors at Madison College, where he claimed to have gone and graduated from, and he would do those phony back and forths where it looked like the college was telling Chandler, sorry, you can't get your transcripts. It's this huge problem that's totally our fault, not yours, but you just gotta wait. There's nothing else you can do. We can't get them for you right now. And when Chandler would send these exchanges to Bart would get totally worked up about it, and finally he demanded that Chandler give him a phone number so he can talk to one of these college advisors. And so Chandler went out and got a burner phone from a convenience store, and he gave that phone number to his dad, and then when his dad called this number up, somebody picked up, someone introducing themselves as Daniel Spieth, which really was just Chandler disguising his voice. And Daniel Spieth would give Bart the same spiel about how, oh, I'm so sorry, it's all the college's fault that we can't get your son's transcripts, you're just gonna have to wait. And so finally, on June 29th, 2021, Bart had just had it with his son. He was convinced his son was lying, or there was something going on, there was just too much about his son's life that didn't add up. And so Bart decided he was just going to call Madison College and pretend to be Chandler and see if he could get his transcripts. And so he dialed a number for customer service at Madison College, and after a few rings, Omar Job, a customer service rep at Madison College, picked up. And initially, Bart was kind of aggressive and mean towards Omar for really no reason other than he was just so frustrated with this whole situation. And so he's on this call pretending to be Chandler, and he's kind of barking at Omar to give me my transcripts right now. I go to your school. There's no reason you can keep them from me. But then after a couple of minutes, Omar finally was able to talk. And he said, hey, Chandler, I looked you up in the system and you don't go to this school. You've never gone to the school, save for maybe one semester, and you failed out. And so it's at this point when Bart hears this that he just pauses for a really long amount of time on this call, and then he begins asking follow-up questions that are not really connected to trying to get transcripts, because now he knows the transcripts don't exist because his son didn't go to school. And so he begins asking Omar, does Daniel Spieth still work there? And so Omar would look him up and he would say, no, there's no Daniel Spieth that works here, and there's no Daniel Spieth that's ever worked here. And because Chandler had used like 5 or 6 different names when pretending to be college advisors for Madison College, Bart, in addition to asking about that Daniel Spieth guy, asked about every other name he had interacted with, believing he was talking to Madison College, and one by one, Omar told him, I'm sorry, those people do not work here. I've never heard of these people. They're not in the directory. I'm sorry. And so finally, at the end of that 17-minute call, Bart knew his son was living a huge lie. And so he hung up with Omar, and then Bart called real college advisors at Madison College, and he set a meeting for July 1st at 3 p.m. And then he told Chandler that he had set this meeting, and Chandler was going to come with him, and they together were going to ask those college advisors why they can't produce Chandler's transcripts. Now, Bart, of course, knew Chandler did not have transcripts, and so he likely had set this meeting to get Chandler to call the meeting off and come clean about this big lie so that Bart could get his son back on the right track, stop lying, and live a real life. But the way Chandler handled being caught was not to own up to any of this. He didn't call off the meeting. He just waited until the day of the meeting, and then he killed his father, killed his mother, and then dismembered their bodies and burned their body parts in the family fireplace, including their heads. And then when he couldn't destroy their bodies completely, he took what was left of their remains and scattered them all over town in parks and forests and rivers. He even put his father's headless, armless, legless torso behind his girlfriend's parents' house. And all the while, as he's doing this, he's spinning this ridiculous story to his girlfriend, to his brother, to other members of the Halderson family, to police, to colleagues of Bart and Krista, that Bart and Krista just up and left on the morning of July 2nd with this mystery couple. And oh, by the way, my parents, they were putting cash and silver bars in their luggage. So I don't know, they went up to White Lake and now they're gone. I don't know what happened to them. We don't know why Chandler chose the story he did. It's unclear if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were suspicious and had gotten into something that had maybe gotten them harmed or kidnapped, or if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were just super gullible and had been taken advantage of by this mystery couple. We don't know. He was just trying to make the whole situation seem plausibly suspicious. Ultimately, though, Chandler did so many things that got him caught. From the mountain of physical evidence he left behind inside of his house, where he killed and dismembered his parents, and also at the various dump sites where he didn't even bury the body parts. He would just put them underneath sticks and branches, and so they were very easy to find. To his extremely suspicious behavior on July 7th, when he walked into the police station and reported his parents missing. That whole time he was talking to police officers, he was acting so weird and was just saying things that didn't make sense, and he just totally came off like a guy who did not care at all that his parents were gone, and really just seemed like a guy who was hiding something. But the big breakthrough that happened on July 8th that broke the case open stemmed from the text message Krista's phone sent to Chandler's phone on July 4th. When Chandler walked into the police station on July 7th and said, "My parents are missing," one of the first questions they had for him was, "Okay, well, when was the last time you spoke to your parents?" And Chandler would tell them he got a text message from his mother, Krista, on Sunday, July 4th. And then he showed them the text message. And the text message said that they had arrived in White Lake and they were going to be sticking around for the parade and they'd be back in a couple of days. But the police noticed that this text message had been sent on July 4th, but in White Lake that year, the parade was on July 3rd. So when this text came through, the parade that anyone in White Lake would be aware of, it's a small place, you're not going to miss this parade. The parade had already happened. So why would Krista be texting her son that she was going to stick around in White Lake for the parade that had already happened? And so this led police to check phone records, and they would discover that text message was sent from Krista's phone to Chandler's phone, but when it was sent on July 4th, Krista's phone was not in White Lake. Instead, it was inside of the Halderson home, right near Chandler's phone. And so when police went to the Halderson house, they searched it and they found Krista's phone in the garage, underneath a drawer, inside of a shoe, wrapped in tinfoil, next to her driver's license. And so Chandler had obviously sent that text message on July 4th using his mother's phone to himself. But he had just gotten the date wrong of the parade. And so this discrepancy really opened up the floodgates, and before long, it was beyond obvious that Chandler was the killer. And after a thorough investigation, it was determined that Chandler had acted entirely alone, meaning Catherine, his girlfriend, and his brother Mitchell had nothing to do with it. They were just innocent bystanders. Chandler would ultimately be found guilty of killing his parents, and he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chandler has still not taken any responsibility for what he's done. Instead, he just tells anybody who will listen that his plan is to continue to appeal his verdict.
thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is in a deep sleep, glue a wig onto their head along with a beard-mustache combo, then decorate their bedroom to look like a hospital suite, and then violently wake them up and tell them that they've been in a medically induced coma for several years. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the Mr. Ballin Foundation, and it honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families.